Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Valora Washington. I am CEO of the CAYL Institute. That's Community Advocates for Young Learners. And it is always my pleasure to welcome you to the CAYL Catalyst webinar series. Every first Thursday of the month at 4 o'clock Eastern Time, we bring you these conversations, important conversations about children and families and the early childhood education workforce. All of our webinars are free and easily accessible on our website. Again, we really welcome you today. So we are the CAYL Institute, and we have several values and visions that we stand for. We have 5 core principles that you can see on the screen. And in the past few months, we've been bringing our attention to these principles in the context of moonshots that we really want for our children and for the teachers. And so these moonshots are what we consider to be monumental efforts, lofty goals that we want for our children and for the people who work with children. And we want to shed a light on the need for a giant leap forward for our children. We were inspired by John F. Kennedy, who really called the nation to action about going to the moon. What he said in 1961 was that he believed that we should commit ourselves right away to going to the moon, that no single project could be more important or more valuable or more exciting or more impressive. And that's the way we feel about early childhood education and working with families today. We think nothing could be more urgent than getting this right. And so President Kennedy also said that he wanted this moonshot not because it was easy, but because it was hard. Exactly. It is going to be hard. It is going to be challenging to give our children and families what they really deserve. But nevertheless, we're proposing these moonshots for children and for families and the workforce. Earlier in August and September, we set out moonshots for children. We said no child should be excluded, and we should really stop this exclusion of children from preschool and early education programs. We also said that all children should be included, regardless of any particular needs that they may have. All children should be included. No child should be excluded. And when we turned our attention to the early childhood education workforce, we said that we needed early childhood education jobs to be better jobs, to be good jobs. And what could we do to really recruit and retain a talented workforce? And now this month, as we wrap up our Moonshot series, we're turning our attention to families. How do we have brave conversations with each other and with the families we serve? And how can families step up to have these brave conversations with their children? This could seem like a really big moonshot to accomplish, but we think it is so possible. And so how do we make this happen? We'd love for you to write in the chat right now an answer to a question. What comes to your mind when we think about today's topic of powerful parenting with brave conversations? What comes to your mind? We'd love to hear that. And, as we think about this, we really ask you to share things in the chat because this is a really serious question, we think. And as early childhood educators, we know that we are models for children. We never have to worry about children listening to us because we know they are always watching us. So how do we, as teachers and parents, family members, how do we model the strength and courage that we want our children to have? How do we give each child that assurance that they really matter? And it's the individual things about them that make them so precious and so beautiful in our supportive communities. We've written a number of things about these kinds of topics and hope that you can find useful some of the resources that we have prepared for educators and families, because now is the time for us to think about the next level advocacy strategies for teaching and parenting our young children. We really want you to think about that because childhood has changed and families have changed too. As we're having this conversation, here's a few announcements. We are recording. We record these webinars to make them free to the public. And for many of our colleagues who are working with children at this hour who cannot tune in at 4 o'clock, closed captioning is available. We have a Q&A session at the end. So when this webinar ends at 5, we'll be putting the link in the chat. If you want to talk to our panelists today, click that link and you can go into a live conversation with them. And also we encourage you to write in the chat throughout this webinar at all times. So let's dig into it. Today, we are going to have the conversation about powerful parenting and brave conversations with our children. And we have some really talented people who are going to share their insights with us about brave conversations and powerful parenting. Denisha, Kaliris, and Rose are going to share their stories about parenting. And one of the things that we're going to hear, as we already know, great teaching, great parenting, all built on relationships. It's not about rigid rules, but it's about, can we be vulnerable together? How can we have healthy conflict? And what is the order and direction that we want to set with our children? And we realize once again that if we want parents to talk about things that are interesting to children, like identity is interesting to them, gender is interesting to them, family pride is interesting to them, then we realize that we have to have brave conversations. We have to help children have a strong sense of who they are, as well as empathy with others. And we know from decades of research that children become aware of race and bias at a very early age, that they begin at a very early age to understand that there is a value attached to color, and they begin to internalize those messages. That's why we have to have these brave conversations, because we want children to have strong thoughts and feelings for themselves, and also to interact with others in ways that demonstrate empathy. So let's hear what our 3 panelists have to say to us today. I'm really thrilled that we have Denisha Jones, who is the Executive Director of Defending the Early Years. She's a former kindergarten teacher, former preschool director. She spent 20 years in teacher education, and she has for many years served on the steering committee for the National Black Lives Matter at School Week of Action. We also have Dr. Kaliris Salas-Ramirez, who's Associate Professor at Rutgers University, Robert Wood Johnson Medical School in the Department of Neuroscience and Cell Biology, where she co-directs courses in that area. And most of her research has focused on sex differences, development, pharmacology, and addiction. She's an anti-racist practitioner and the mother of 2 boys. And finally, our 3rd panelist, we have Rose Reyes, who is a Black, queer, neurodivergent, 2-spirit, non-binary Taino parent. Their teaching and learning and parenting practice centers historically and culturally affirming curriculum with the emphasis on child development. And it's shaped by education as the practice of freedom. Very strong panel that we're presenting to you today. So as we listen to them and we think about how we're going to work with the children in our own lives, we know that we have to prepare and be mindful when we have these brave conversations. We know that we need to keep it age appropriate. We know that we all need to keep learning and talking together. And as we listen to what our panelists say, I want you to hear the questions and thoughts that they have, the kind of inclusive language, and how all of us have to keep learning and talking. So let's begin with our first speaker. Really love to have you join us, Denisha. Thank you so much. Wonderful to be such a great partner with Defending the Early Years and the courageous work and the brave conversations that you have in your role. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Melora, and thank you everyone at CAYL Institute for organizing this. We are so happy. I was just telling the DEY board, working with you guys has been fantastic. It's been a really great experience, so thank you so much. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. One, because I am a new parent in a way. Last year, I adopted two wonderful teenagers from Colombia, and so yeah, I've been parenting for a year now, and it's very interesting and new, and I love the opportunity to speak in this role. But I've also been working with parents for a very long time. So I've been in early childhood for a long time, teacher education, and I do professional development. And often, sometimes I do speak to parent groups about positive racial identity development in young children and play and other factors. So I speak to parents a lot about my research and my work and my teaching, but now I also get to think about that in terms of parenting teenagers who are they're they're Afro-Colombian, so we share the similar racial background, but they're new to the United States, and there's a lot they don't know about United States culture and our issues. So trying to navigate all of that has been really, really important. And I'm not saying I'm 100% getting it right, but I'm trying for sure. So I just want to share a couple tidbits that I share with parents and things that I've thought about from my own parenting that I think are helpful, right? So one of the things when I talk to parents and they're like, well, how do we have these tough conversations with children? Where do you start? And I always say, decide what the overall idea you want your child is to understand, right? So perhaps you are responding to something that has already happened, right? At the time in 2020, we saw the murder of George Floyd kind of galvanized the country. And we had to think about, how do you have this conversation with children? And actually, I'll make sure this link is shared, but at Defending the Early Years, we did a video on this with one of our partners. Is named Susan Lynn, and she's a ventriloquist, and she has her duck, Audrey Duck. So we did a video where we showed how to model having this conversation with Audrey. And what we did was make it seem like Audrey overheard Susan and I talking about the George Floyd protests, and she got scared and had questions, right? So you might be responding to your child in a sense that they are hearing something is happening and they want to know what's going on. And that's, so understanding what do you want them to get out of that message. But you also might decide that I just want to have this conversation with my child. But the idea is, what do you want them to understand? So if the topic, right, that we've heard, Black Lives Matter or equal rights for LGBTQ people, or women should have control over their own bodies, or never again means never again for anyone, right? We've heard these slogans, right, in the different contexts of the world that we're living in right now. But what is the key underlying idea encapsulated within each of these topics that we want young children to understand? What do you want your child to understand about these statements and why they're being made, and why you might be making them or why other people might be making them, right? I think it's really important that you get clear on what that is. And so just something to think, right, is depending. Now, if they're asking you questions right away, you got to think on the fly, right? And you can do that. And you can also say to child, that's a really good question. Can you give me a minute to think through the best way to come up with my idea? Like, I think we feel like we have to answer kids' questions right away, but it actually models for them the thinking process if we ask them for a minute to gather our thoughts, right? It shows them that that's something that we do when we're thinking critically. So we can definitely ask for time, but really think about what is the underlying message you want them to have. The second thing I would say is, don't assume your child is going to respond with a counter statement, right? So in my role in Black Lives Matter School, I was fortunate to do some research on teachers who teach our 13 guiding principles. And I had a nice subset of early childhood teachers, right? So pre-K, kindergarten, first grade teachers that I got to interview. And so one of them is a white female teacher in New York City. And, she said she was very nervous to say to a bunch of white four-year-olds, right? I think it's a pre-K class in Brooklyn, Black Lives Matter. She thought for sure someone's going to say, well, don't all lives matter? Here's the thing. That's not something a 4 or 5-year-old typically is going to say, right? Because that's not something that's natural to their development. What they said to her was, duh, of course Black Lives Matter. Like, why would you even, why does that need to be said? They kind of looked at her like, well, that makes sense, right? Because they're little and they understand fairness, and they understand that of course Black people's lives should matter, right? It didn't occur to them to counter that with, well, no, they don't, right? Now, older kids are different. The high school teacher we interviewed said that some of the high school students did say, well, don't all lives matter, right? Because they've heard that, right? They're old enough to understand that that is a statement that's being said in the public, right? But not younger children. So don't always assume they're going to counter that statement with you. Often young kids want to know why something that makes sense to them is such a big deal. So then she had to pivot because they wanted to know, well, why do you have to say something that should already be true, right? So she had to follow up with something, well, not everyone believes Black lives should matter, right? And we have a long history in this country of doing things that made people feel like not all lives mattered and not Black lives mattered, right? And so she had to frame it, and she framed it that way, and it was really helpful for the children. So the other thing is then to think about how much information should you be providing without overloading them, right? This is often the hardest part, is knowing how much to say and when, right? You don't want to sit your kid down and give them a 25-minute lecture on enslavement and something brutal things, right? When that's not what they're asking, right? You have to kind of decide what are they asking and how to give them the information. So again, the best advice is always to keep it really simple. For example, you might say, some people don't believe that women should be able to make important decisions about their own body. We disagree with that, and we work to ensure all women have equal rights and can make decisions by themselves and with consulting their doctor. And then if the children says, well, what kind of decisions are they not letting women make? Then you're going to want to further that question, right? And think about what you want to say. But you don't want to start and give up all that information because you don't know how much do they need to understand that concept. And what you want is for the child to logically follow up with their own questions. That shows you their line of thinking, right? So if you give that basic information and then maybe it's right away, it might be the next day, it might be 3 days later when they come back to you, right? Because that's how their brain is processing it. But that next question shows you how they are thinking about what you told them. So you don't want to give them too much information that strains their ability to make sense of it in their own way, but you do want to be prepared to follow up when they come back at you with more questions. So it's a balancing act, right? Not everyone knows how to do it, but you want to be accurate as much as possible. In the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in a Cafeteria by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, she had a great story of this with her son when he was young, when he was about preschool age, at the grocery store, talking about skin tone. And she was like, I was not prepared in the middle of the grocery store to talk to my child about enslavement, but she could not fully answer his question. So she kept it really simple and just was like, the long ago part, before you and I were born, before your grandparents were born, before their grandparents were born, right? And she tells this simple story of, Africans being kidnapped and being brought to this country to work for free. And then she kind of left it at that. And then as time went on, he had more questions that she was able to elaborate on him as well. So that's really important to just, the less information is probably better until you know where exactly the child is going and what exactly they're asking you as well. I also tell folks to resist trying to make everything sound good. I think one of the things that we do as a disservice to children is we make it sound like oppression and pain is a thing of the past, right? I remember a parent telling me when she finally got it is that her daughter came home from school and said, Mom, I'm so happy that Dr. Martin Luther King ended racism. And her mom's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Is that what you're getting from all of this, right? And she had to think about it. And the way we teach about it, yes, the kids walk away thinking it's over. It ended at the March on Washington. It ended when we desegregated the lunch counters. And this is a thing of the past instead of this is something that's still happening in different ways today. And so I think it's because we want to so much tell parents to tell kids a very happy story. And this isn't all very happy stuff, right? So we have to think about how can we tell the story in ways that doesn't make it a quite rosy picture all the time. Also because it gives children, if they always think we're trying to tell them something positive, they don't trust us that we're going to tell them the truth, especially as they get older. So that's something to think about as well too. So to help me think about how do you talk to children about ideas that are so tense, right, and hard, right, without wanting to paint everything into a rosy picture, is there's this thing called vent diagrams. So vent with a T, diagrams, and so let me back up. So I use vent diagrams, which allow us to hold two contradictory ideas together at the same time. So instead of focusing on the overlapping shared space in a Venn diagram, so Venn diagrams take two ideas and we look at what's in the middle, vent diagrams focus on the outside of the overlapping circles, right? The two contradictory statements. And then we focus on to imagine what the overlap might be if we are holding these two things to be true, right? So I think about this in terms of adoption. So many of you might have heard of adoption, know someone adopted, touched by adoption. Maybe you're an adoptee or an adoptive parent, right? But typically, until you get into the space of adoption as an adoptee or an adoptive parent, you don't really, adoption is painted as this very rosy, beautiful process, right? Which it can be, but it's not always that way, right? So I've learned that there are lots of contradictory, but true at the same time statements in adoption, right? So one of them is, right, adoption is a beautiful way to make a family. That's what we hear. We call it the unicorn roses story of adoption. That is true. I've made my family through adoption, and it is very beautiful. At the very same time, adoption results from the primal wound of family separation, and it is very traumatic. It is the most traumatic thing any person will ever have to go through, whether they were adopted at birth or adopted as teenagers. It doesn't matter, right? They're suffering. It's really painful, but at the same time, it's really beautiful. And I can't lean into one or the other. I can't tell my children, let's just focus on the good, right? This is all good. You're living here in America. You're so lucky now, without the pain that comes along with that, right? And that's what we want to do. We want to protect our children and we want to shield the pain, but we can't always do that. We have to lean into both. So I tell them that I am, I get it. Like they might wish this never happened to them, and that's okay, right? And so we want to think about how can we live in these spaces at the same time? What are the overlapping parts of those two contradictory things? So the other one, we hear this a lot. I've learned this a lot from adoptees. Adoptees should be grateful that they were chosen, right? And then at the same time, adoptees should not be grateful for the pain of being relinquished or separated that led to their adoption, right? We never ask anyone to be grateful for their pain. So why are we asking them? So how do we live in those two things, right? And they're hard, but we don't want to push to the one side and only make it rosy. And we don't want to only focus on the pain. We want to uphold those two things, right? Honoring adoptive parents, but also recognizing that adoption should not be about me. It should be about children, right? It should be about children who need families. So how do we live with these things? So those are just a couple of ideas on how I use the Venn diagrams, and it just helps me to process these things without pushing everything to the good side, but to stay on both sides. Some other things I tell people is that children learn so much from our silence. If we are silent about things that matter, they're taking from that. So please don't be silent about these important things, right? Even if you don't know what to say, you can say that. There's something terrible happening in the world right now, children, and I don't know what to say, but I want you to know that I'm thinking about it, that it's happening, and that I don't want to be silent, right? Children learn from what we say and do as well, too, right? So if we say one thing and do another, what do you think they're going to believe, right? They're going to think about our actions sometimes more than our words. So we have to be sure that they match up, that if we say we believe in liberation and justice and all that, but we're not doing those things, what message does that send the child? And then children need us to model the skills, dispositions, and attitudes we want them to develop, right? If we want them to develop critical thinking, we have to model that for them. If we want them to develop honesty and compassion and empathy, we have to model that for them. So I know that's a lot, and I know I'm going to come back, but I want to turn it over now to my good friend and colleague on the panel, Dr. Kaliris, Salas-Ramirez. I think I got that right, I hope, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about this topic. There she is. Salas-Ramirez. Almost got it right.
After 6 years of friendship, Denisha.
Sorry.
I love you. Hi, everybody. So I'm Kaliris Salas-Ramirez. I am a neuroscientist by training. I also serve on the New York City School Board, and I'm the mom of 2 public school students here in New York City. One of which is 12. He has an IEP, and then I have a 4-year-old that has had the advantage of being part of both the 3K and pre-K and universal pre-K program here in New York City. That has been a beautiful experience for us as a family, particularly after the pandemic. My 3-year-old was able to go to a regular public school with an amazing teacher and a beautiful environment for him to start his educational experience. And so I'm really proud of the fact that I can say that both of my kids both experienced universal pre-K in New York City, something that we have been very proud of, and something that we need to really talk about, a movement, to have this movement across the country. As a neuroscientist, I very much value these different experiences for young babies, because the more experiences we provide for them, in these spaces, the more they learn, the more they understand their social surroundings, the more they have the ability to engage. And the more we invest in early childhood education, the more we save as an economy later on in the future. So it's been a beautiful thing. And I'm grateful to be in a city that has provided that for my kids for free. I know that's not the experience of all parents. I also know that we in New York City are also at a time where we have an administration that thinks a little bit differently about these experiences for children, and have decided to use prepackaged curriculum to engage even our youngest learners. I will say that it comes at a time where we're looking at data that has to do with literacy rates across the country, literacy rates in New York City. Unfortunately, the metric that we use are standardized tests, and we can talk about how children are not standardized and how flawed the system is for using this metric to categorize not just children, but also to, in some cases, evaluate teachers, and in every case to think about the efficacy of schools. But children are not standardized. And so the beauty about the universal pre-K program that was developed in our former administration was that it was very much play-based, and it allowed for teacher-developed curriculum to be at the center of how teachers, social workers, and educational administrators to engage with our learners and to support our learners. And so it's, when you're sitting in the space of seeing how amazing that was for your oldest child, and seeing the potential of that being taken away for your youngest, it puts you in a position to really think about what are we doing in terms of the future of education in this city, but also in this country. A lot of people tend to follow what New York does because we do serve almost 1 million students in our system. So as a neuroscientist and as a policy person, or at least somebody that sits in the space to be able to support policy decisions, I spend a lot of my time really engaging educators, parents, and leaders in terms of how do we push back against this privatization of public education? How do we push back against this use of prepackaged curriculum? And how do we push back against the fear mongering of who our children are and how they should be treated in our public schools? New York City is the most segregated educational system in the whole country, in addition to housing system. And so we spend a lot of time talking about how do we integrate our schools. Our schools, for the first time, are fully funded, but policymakers and legislators are making decisions that continue to disinvest in our Black and Latino communities. We're also in a time in history where we are welcoming our newest New Yorkers. I don't like to say the word asylum seeker, but we are in a time where we are supporting some of our most vulnerable students that very young in their lives have experienced trauma, have interrupted education, and we are actively disinvesting in our public schools in addition to losing our stimulus money. And so it's a critical time where we talk about what happens to our Black and Latino students. Are they being seen? What happens to our multilingual learners? Are we really engaging them and teaching them and welcoming them and creating an environment of belonging when they've already gone through so many traumatic experiences in their life that can impact their ability to learn effectively? So we do know that the more stress that you have, particularly in early childhood, that increases the likelihood of you experiencing anxiety and depression, particularly during adolescence. We do know that adolescence is a second critical period where a child's brain, our learners' brains, are actively changing. So, young people, little people from the ages of 2 and 3 are, yes, absolutely understanding what social surroundings are, and, you know, developing their language, thinking about their social skills, identifying who individuals are in their lives, understanding their own identity, and things continue to be incorporated into their brain in terms of that identity. So we know that children within the ages of 6 to 7 already understand race and their racial identity and their positionality in the world. And so there's a significant fallacy, as Denisha was talking about, of not engaging young children in these conversations, because they do have that understanding by the ages of 2 and 3 as well. They understand gender and they understand who they are. So when a child says that they identify as one particular gender over another, believe them, because they know what it is. And so all of these different conversations, complex and nuanced conversations, it's important for us to have with them as parents through a developmentally appropriate environment, in addition to teachers having that ability to engage students. We recently had an experience here in New York City where our chancellor basically told our educators to not talk to our students about what's happening in Gaza. And that created significant tensions across our schools, not just amongst educators because they felt muzzled and silenced, but also our students because they were confused and didn't understand what was happening. And they're looking at social media and they're thinking about what's happening in the world and other kids dying. And so there's been significant outroar because we must have these conversations with our children. If we don't, that again increases their trauma, their stress, their anxiety, and their depression. During adolescence is another critical period where it's this transition from childhood to adulthood, where your brain has the ability also to incorporate a lot of these social schemas and understanding of who we are and what our environment is, and how our environment can impact us. And we can't forget that during that time, we're going to have a lot of young people that are going to be making mistakes, but it's all because they're trying to understand who they are in the environment. And it's all because they're trying to understand what their role is. And so we talk about how teenagers engage in these risk-taking behaviors. We spend less time talking about how that's such a ripe time to develop who they are, their identities, and how they move forward in this world, and giving them some grace. They don't have the connections that we have as adults. And in fact, the adolescent brain doesn't finish getting organized until mid-20s for a lot of people. So in terms of having these courageous conversations, we have to, one, I always tell parents, reflect yourself, spend time with yourself, figuring out who you are, what your identity is, how you can learn about having those conversations, so that you can model that behavior for your own child. We've been fortunate in my household where we identify as Afro-Latino to be in schools that have allowed my children to have those conversations, not just educators with children, but also educators and parents within the school community. And it's been transformative, I think, for us as a family, but also in terms of what kinds of decisions I make as an educator for health professionals, as well as somebody that sits at the table to create policy, to decide on curriculum, and to decide on regulations here in our New York City public schools. So I know that's a lot as well, but I want to pass it on to Rose, who's going to continue the conversation that we're having here today. Thanks, everybody.
Wow, thank you, Kaliris. Apologies. Thank you so much, Kaliris. Wow. Hello, everyone. My name is Rose. My pronouns are they, them. Those are the words that feel good when talking about my body. I am so grateful to be here and share this space with you all and be in this co-learning environment, and really grateful to all of the organizers. I want to take a moment to allow us to get grounded again, maybe unmask a bit and take a breath, if that's okay, like a collective moment for a somatic practice. If you can put your hands on your heart for a moment, and we'll take a breath in for 4, hold for 4, and release. So breathing in, hold, release. One more time, breathing in, hold, and release. If you need to take a moment to grab a sip of water or shift your body in any way that allows you to feel more comfortable, folks are digging and sharing so much, and I wanted to also share with that practice some affirmations by Cole Arthur Riley, the creator around Black author and creator around Black liturgies. So we can inhale. I don't have to perform normalcy. Exhale. My soul is a witness. Inhale. No one survives alone. Exhale. We get free together. I just wanted to share that time and space to kind of ground us during these impossible times. Before engaging in a bit of my own brave conversation, a bit around what parenting for collective liberation looks like for me and my family. So what that teaching and parenting experience looks like without reinforcing existing systems of domination or oppression, sharing a bit about my praxis, a praxis being a focus on like that action that we're taking, that continuous reflection upon the world and the change and what is needed in the world in order to change it. So my pedagogy is informed by Black feminist theory. So bringing in bell hooks, teaching to transgress. I wanted to add my voice to the collective call for renewal and rejuvenation in our teaching practices, urging all of us to open our minds and hearts so that we can know beyond the boundaries of what is acceptable, so that we can think and rethink, so that we can create new visions. I celebrate teaching that enables transgressions of movement against and beyond binaries. It is the movement which makes education the practice of freedom. To educate as the practice of freedom is a way to teaching that anyone can learn. That learning process comes easiest to those of us who teach, who also believe that there is an aspect of our vocation that is sacred, who believe that our work is not merely to share information, but to share in the intellectual and spiritual growth of our students, to teach in a manner that respects and cares for our souls of our students. Essential if we are to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin. Bell hooks reminds us classroom, and I'll add home, adding on both my educator and parent hats. The classroom and home remain the most radical space of possibility. So thank you again for this space in collective dreaming and pursuing education and sharing that as a way of freedom making. Wanting to name that no one is free until everyone is free, and in naming that interconnectedness, knowing that these systems of oppression are connected and harm us all. So these being racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, and because with that truth, there's also truth in our freedom all being tied to each other. And I wanted to also share a quote by Valerie Kerr. If we can shift culture and consciousness right where we are only, we can shift culture and consciousness right where we are only if we are believing in our own sweet wisdom, only if we are willing to say, even when our voice trembles, their children are our children. So and sharing brave conversations around global pursuits and fight against oppressive systems in our efforts to create a more just world for ourselves and our children. So I wanted to quickly share the 4 goals of anti-bias education, and then a bit of what that looks like for me and my family, kind of like some tools that we use. So this work stems from the research and literature by Louise Thurman Sparks and Julie Olson Edwards, but they're really core foundational goals that begin with identity. So students demonstrating self-awareness, confidence, family pride, positive social identities, which then builds to our second goal around diversity, students expressing comfort of their joy of the human diversity, accurate language for human differences, deep, caring human connections across diverse backgrounds. So teachers will promote each child's comfortable, empathetic interaction with people from diverse backgrounds, and really nurturing that, modeling that, bringing in literature that support that practice. The third goal is around justice. So students will increasingly recognize unfairness, injustice, have language to describe that unfairness, and understand that unfairness hurts. And with hopes to build a society powerful for the fourth goal of activism, where students and ourselves will demonstrate a sense of empowerment and the skills to act with others alone against prejudice and discriminatory actions. So as a parent of a very young child, a toddler, right now our world's really living in that identity building, building that self-awareness, love for our racial and group identities, love for their skin, their hair, really, really tying in those first 2 goals around sharing the beauty of the diversity of the beauty of human diversity. So in these times, specifically sharing the beauty of different languages, written languages, different faiths, clothings, hats or garments of faith, how that no matter a human's faith, everyone is deserving of that safety. Thinking about building a world to be powerful enough to name unfairness. So with a toddler or very young ones, some of their first words, or just for parents, challenging words can be no or why. And I really I love the those as constant reminders for checking and giving a space for bravery around around inequity. So I want to offer space and for having brave conversations around like what your no's are. So radical no's are for me right now, no, I don't believe that any family, any child deserves to be unalived under a collective excuse me, collective punishment. that are knowing that even our young ones are so in tune to that innate fairness and human dignity, or respect for all life. Our little one is even thinking about the ways that they care and offer space and water, checking on all of our living, our understanding that connection to our natural world, that water is life, that it is something for our plants, our animals in community, and in loving that we're in loving relationship with, and that as we name and have these brave conversations about injustices that are happening in the world, also kind of in order to not all leave us in a sea of despair, or our young children in seas of despair, that to continuously name that the world is being changed and has been changed, continues to be changed by brave folks that are fighting for justice. I want to name that a lot of these important tools or artifacts of love and representation that I incorporate in my parenting and teaching and learning are children's literature. So thinking about representation in our books, how we're showing a joyous, non-monolithic representation of people's. So we read banned books, we support our local library, we are in community with folks there as a space for dreaming and kinship and peacemaking. So there's so many things I wanted to share with you all, but a core text I would recommend for folks is Prejudice and Your Child by Dr. Kenneth Clark. And if you are familiar with Dr. Mimi and Kenneth Clark's doll study, they are core psychologists, researchers to the mental effects of systemic racism, how that impacts the racial consciousness of Black children, and the impacts of internalized white supremacy, and definitely needed as much as the days it were written. So I would recommend for all folks. I want to just raise up a call that in the that he shares in What Can Parents Do? He says Black parents are in providing for their children socially constructive opportunities for achievement. Parents from minority groups in general have a greater responsibility to their children than other parents. They must be sensitive to the necessity of counteracting the social forces that ordinarily tend to rob their children of self-esteem. And I call in for the white parents share that white parents then can make a major contribution to America. They can strengthen the democratic foundations of our nation by helping their children to be free of the distortions inherent in racial thinking, and thus helping them to gain strong and creative personalities. In doing this, they will help not only their own children, but all children.
Absolutely. Those are such powerful words from Dr. Kenneth Clark 5 decades ago that we still see are relevant in raising children today. I'm going to ask all of our panelists to join us, I want to remind everyone who's listening, if you want to interact with our panelists, there's going to be a link in the chat. And as soon as we end this at 5 o'clock, you can join that link for an opportunity to talk with our panelists. I love one of the things that you said, Rose, when you talked about really when we can acknowledge that their children are our children. That is such a powerful statement to be able to do that. So how do we respond as powerful, brave parents and educators when books are banned and we're living in an era of censorship and there's been a lot of reframing of historical facts, and how do we respond to all this as educators and as parents? Any of you, I'm wondering your thoughts on this.
I mean, I think personally, if a book is banned, I want my kids to read it. I want to, let's get that on the shelf right away. That's the list of books we go to right away, because if it's being banned, it's because people are threatened by what it says. And if they're threatened by what it says, it's probably something we believe in. I'm just going to be honest, right? They don't ban the things I wish they banned, right? They don't ban those things. And it's not that I want things to be banned, but they don't ban the books that I wouldn't give my child to read, right? Like those stories that are out there. So I think it's important that we have honest conversations about why people don't want you to get this knowledge. And what does that mean? If somebody thinks that the contents of the books are so dangerous that no one should read them, what does that mean, right? What does that mean? Help kids understand that, because it's not that this is a story I don't think is appropriate for you. This is a story that I don't think any child should read. Why does anyone have the right to dictate what any other child reads? If I think it's a good story and you think it's a good story, why should anyone be able to keep you from reading it, even if they don't want their own kid to read it? Right? I think kids can grapple with that because they're going to tell you that's not cool. That's not cool at all. They're like, that's not fair. What do you mean you're going to tell you, right? They know they have this innate sense of fairness. And I think we need to lean into it and let them see why something like that is problematic. Why should one person get to dictate what every child in America reads?
White parents are so uncomfortable. I'm sorry, I'm going to call it out, with having these conversations because ultimately either they feel guilt or they think that their children are going to start internalizing all the things that our children have internalized for centuries. And so I can share a little anecdote. About a year and a half ago, with a new chancellor, we had to look for new superintendents in New York City, or superintendents were going through these town halls. And I see Megan Madison in the chat. Her book, Our Skin, which is legitimately one of the most amazing early childhood books to talk about race. Parents were really upset because we had sent it in for libraries to all these different schools, and white parents in the Upper East Side were upset that that book was in their schools because in the book it states how race is a social construct. And so they literally asked a Black superintendent candidate if he believed that white people invented racism and at what year. And some of us were outraged. We were like, we need to stop this. Can you believe they did stop the question, so they didn't have to answer publicly? But then the Department of Education asked each candidate, a Black candidate and a white candidate, to respond to the local school board in writing. And then that was leaked to the press. So, I mean, and I'm like, wait a minute. A month ago, we just had the massacre in Buffalo, and we're going to put this Black man on the spot and ask him this question. Like, this is how uncomfortable, intimidated white parents are to have this conversation. We're literally just saying, hey, this is a social construct. We can transform the lives of all of our children, but y'all can't let go of your power and privilege. That part.
Wow. Yeah, it's their children are our children. Our children are their children, to get people to really understand that. One of the things that's really interesting to me, I know that my own daughter, when she was a young child, about the age of Ruby Bridges, read the story of Ruby Bridges. She was about Ruby Bridges' age at the time. And since that time, Ruby Bridges has been like a very personal hero for her, shero for her. One of the things that's really interesting now is even in these stories, they're being reframed in many ways to erase race from the story, which is incredible. If it hadn't been for the construct of race, the story would not have existed. How do you deal with this reframing? A lot of reframing going on in books and textbooks, and how people are talking to children about historical events.
So reframing for what purpose, right? There's a quote going around that says, it's not, the world we have couldn't exist based on the history we've been told, right? Like, it's just a reality, right? Like, two things don't add up. Like, you either you don't live in this world, or the history you're told is not accurate, right? But you can't get to where we are. And it is this belief, this desire that we want to paint ourselves as the good guys. America is a good country founded by good people on good beliefs, but that contradicts with the reality of how this country came to be, and the things that were done to the natives, right? To the Africans, to the people who are on this land, to the people who were brought to this land against their will. And so, there's a war happening amongst people who don't want to admit that mistakes were made, horrible things were happening, that the wealth was built off the backs of people who, still haven't been repaid for that, right? And so, the colonization, the displacement, the white supremacy, right? It's all part of it. And I think that's the biggest struggle, because people don't want to acknowledge that, right? But when you think about other countries, like I love talking about what they do in Germany, right? Germany was the site of the Holocaust, right? 6.5 million Jews, right? Killed, right? In that country. They don't let a day go by without remembering what happened on their land, right? Everyone has to learn that hard truth. You can't come in there and act like it didn't happen. You can't have a pro-Hitler flag the way we have Confederate flags. Absolutely not. And as much as it's hard, and as much as nobody wants to talk about it, they will not let you get out of there, especially out of their K through 12 or whatever their education system, without learning that hard reality, because that's what happened in their land, and they have a responsibility to educate everyone about it. We don't take that same approach. This is what happened. It was horrible, and we have a responsibility to see it never happen again by being honest about it. Why are we so scared to be honest? Right? I think our children would appreciate us more if we looked them in the eye and said, this is the truth. You can still love America and admit the truth, right? And many people do. They still love this country for what it is, but they acknowledge all of the bad things, right? But people think it's one or the other. You have to be in love with this country, or you have to be angry at this country. I am in love and angry at this country every day at the same damn time, right? I don't have to pick one or the other. They're both there. And I think we've all expressed that, right? We want more. We want a state of liberation and peace and joy, but we also acknowledge all of the things that are not liberating, that are not peaceful, and are not joyful, right? And that continue to happen. And so for those people who want it to be one way or the other, where does that get us? Where does that get us to paint a rosy picture of falsehood? What does that do for children? It actually sets them up for failure. Tim Wise, the white anti-racist educator, talks about how white children are often unprepared for the realities of the world because they've been sheltered in this bubble. And when the reality hits them, that cognitive dissonance, they don't know what to do. They really don't know what to do, because it's a lot, right? And we've seen a lot of people talking about how they break free of these oppressive upbringings that shelter them, and how they have to break out of it and see the world in a different place. Some people do, some people don't, right? Do we want our kids to be sheltered, or do we want them to be free?
Well, there's so much we can talk about, and I want to engage our audience. Please click the link as we wrap this up, and click the link, and you yourself can engage in conversations with our three panelists. I wanted to just end with this quote from Steve Jobs. He says, "Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things. They're not fond of rules. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them, but the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius, because the ones who are crazy enough to think that they can change the world are the ones who actually do." We really want to thank you for joining this conversation with us today. We want to thank the Eastern Bank Foundation for helping to support this webinar series. And we want to remind you that this is the giving season, and we encourage you, if you've enjoyed this series over the past year, if you wish to make a donation to the CAYL Institute, please do so. You can go to our website to do so. And also, I want to finally thank our CAYL team who have worked so diligently over the past year to bring this webinar to the early childhood education community free of charge and accessible to everyone. Please click the link and join us in conversation with our three panelists to explore these topics of powerful conversations as brave parents. Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you in 2024. Good night.